When we come to the book of Acts, as we have in our daily Bible reading, watching the story unfold as Luke records it, perhaps for us, because it is a text that notoriously is taught in the course of 3 years. We study the book of Acts. It takes us 3 years to get through it. It must have been a preacher joke. But it takes us an awful long time to get through the book of Acts. And probably because we dissect it so much and we break it down into small little parts, it is not for us the reading that perhaps maybe, as Luke pinned it to Theophilus, it was supposed to be. So there's a great deal of excitement as the book unfolds and seeing what the book is about. You may have already noticed when you did the reading that the first 12 chapters are really about how the gospel spread, particularly under the leadership of Peter. And then from then on, you see the development of how the gospel spread under the leadership of the Apostle Paul. Maybe that is intentional, that Luke is trying to record it under those two men, or just maybe very happenstancely, it was those two apostles that God was using in the ways that Luke recorded, while there was much other work being developed by other apostles in other parts of the world that weren't necessary to the story that Luke was trying to record for Theophilus. But here is the point, that Acts seems to focus upon the character of the Apostle Paul and how the Apostle Paul finishes the story of the book of Acts, where he is in Rome under house arrest and moving about freely. Almost as if Luke wants to make the point that the gospel had not been infringed upon, even though the Apostle Paul had spent many years in prison, waiting to see and to have his time at the foot of Caesar to defend the truth of the gospel. But when we come to these last two chapters, Acts 27, it shows Paul accomplishing really what he's been aiming to do all his life. He was a Roman citizen, even though he was a Jew. And he had said in other passages, like in the book of Romans chapter 15, how he had wanted to go to Rome to see them. And many times in chapter 1, verse 13, many attempts to go to Rome, he had been prevented to come. And in chapter 15, he was hoping to come. All of this occurring before what we're reading in Acts chapter 27 and 28. That when Paul finally makes it to Rome, he doesn't make it in the way that he had imagined, coming as a free man to deliver the gospel to the world empire. But still he comes to Rome. And it's interesting that in Acts chapter 28 and verse 14, after Luke's description of the process to get there, which we're going to spend most of our time in chapter 27 talking about, then in verse 14 he says, there we found some brethren and were invited to stay with them for 7 days, and thus we came to Rome. No fireworks, no superlatives, no, wow, this was the greatest moment of our life. We came to Rome. And almost as if it appears to be, maybe we're making much of Paul's desire to be in Rome, but you do have to remember he preached as an apostle for almost 3 decades. Being a Roman citizen, knowing that Rome was the heart of the empire, knowing that securing Christians in a place where the gospel would have great opportunity to affect the traffic that would have affected all of the known world through Rome, Paul wanted to be there. And for 3 decades, he was not able to go. But yet then he went as a prisoner. Of course, the reason that he went is that the Lord said he would go in Acts 23. That he would go as a prisoner, as the Lord's bondservant. And with that title, the Apostle Paul writes many of his letters with probably a sense of pride, and I mean that in the most humble and godly way to describe it, the great joy he would have felt at experiencing that kind of persecution, to be the bondservant of Christ that he was, because he was an apostle chosen by Christ and God the Father to take the gospel to the Greek, and especially to take the gospel in the court of Rome. So read with me beginning in chapter 27. So when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. I need new glasses. And embarking in an Adramyttian ship, there was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. And the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. And from there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. And there the centurion, that is Julius, found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. And when we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salome. And with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a certain place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. And when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be attended with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So when a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had gained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. But before very long there rushed down from the land a violent wind, a northeaster. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. And running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. So after they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables and undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor and so let themselves be driven along. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm assailed us, from then on, all hope of being saved was gradually abandoned. And when they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice, and not to have set sail from Crete, and incurred this damage and loss. And yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there shall be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. And for this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong, and whom I serve before you stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground a certain island.' So when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little farther on they took another sounding and found it to be 15. And fearing that we might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. And as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship, and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, "Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. And until the day was about to dawn, Paul encouraged them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. I encourage you, therefore, to eat some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair from your head of any of you will perish." And having said that, he took bread, and he gave thanks to God in the presence of everyone, and he broke it and began to eat, and all of them were encouraged. Now, it's a very exciting story. What's extraordinary about this section of the book of Acts is the intense descriptive detail that Luke gives about the journey. There have been some people who suggested, most liberal scholars look at it and think that it all makes no sense. But there was a man who wrote in the middle 1800s who himself was a seaman, as well as the fact that he was also a Bible student. And he wrote a book called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. His name was John Smith. And in the book, he goes through and he establishes, because of his own experience on the Mediterranean, he knew exactly everything Luke was describing, saying that even the judgment was given by how long it would take for them to get from place to place, and the judgment of the days, all of it fit in exactly the way he believed it should have been. Of course, there's a good reason for that. It begins, "And embarking on this ship, because Luke himself was a witness." With the same kind of detail, a physician in giving instructions on how to solve someone's medical problem, so too the physician, guided by the Spirit, of course, noticed all of the details that Paul was engaged in so that he could tell this story. There's something else about this reading that I think is important for us to note, is that there is someone in this story that for some reason caught Luke's attention. He's not a major character. He's not a believer, nor anything in it shows that he becomes a man of faith who follows Jesus. But it seemed important for Luke to tell the story in verse 1 of the centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And then he mentions him in verse 6 by not name, without using his name. And there the centurion found the ship and put us on it. The soldiers put the prisoners upon it. And then notice in verse 11, when Paul makes his petition that if we embark on this, we're going to lose our lives, or at least we're going to lose some of them. The centurion wasn't persuaded by Paul, because this Paul didn't have any standing yet with this centurion. But then in verse 31, when Paul says to the centurion and to the soldiers, "If you get off this boat, you will die," something had happened in the centurion and the soldiers to believe everything Paul had said. And so Luke's description of Paul in this interchange is supposed to be significant. That what we notice is the grand leadership of the Apostle Paul while he himself is a prisoner. A prisoner on a ship bound for Rome. A prisoner who, as a Jew, although a Roman citizen, but still as a Jew, was traveling on a boat led by Greeks or pagans. But there was something about this centurion that may not for us match our picture of centurions. The Bible does tell us an awful lot about Cornelius, the centurion that stood by Jesus' side and pierced his side, the centurion that in the record of the Gospels who said he was not worthy for Jesus to enter his house. It's interesting how the Bible, when it mentions centurions, rarely are they ever in a negative context. And so here Julius, notice how he makes this note in verse 3. And on the next day we put in to Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. I don't know what everything is I'm supposed to make of that. But I am struck with these observations. Number one, the inspired writers don't stereotype. A centurion would have been in charge of 100 men, a great and powerful leader. More often than not, a centurion was a man who was placed in that position by right or by earning it because of his skill. It was usually a well-earned position. And so usually centurions had this picture of being very calm and very organized. But when you and I would ever describe a Roman centurion, more often than not, we would describe them as bloodthirsty. We probably would describe them as testosterone to the 100th degree. We would imagine them to be the kind of people who would be insanely empowered with or desirous of their own power. But every time a centurion is described, it's interesting that these centurions are all people who are touched by the presence of God. What's the lesson? Is that you and I cannot get the gospel to people if we prejudge them. That the centurions experienced the presence of God in seeing Jesus on the cross, the centurion being given the message from God, although he was a very moral and upright man who believed in the God of the Jews. But yet, even here, this justice who was assigned making sure Paul and his companions make it to Rome, show him a favor and consideration and allow him to go see his friends. Sometimes we have to know people and we have to look at people to see what good there is to commend so that a bridge can be built to show them the gospel. But there's something else about this centurion, and then we'll move from that. And then I noted with you already is that in verse 31, he learned. He took what he had seen of the Apostle Paul on that ship and learned. And took the word of Paul finally to heart when he said, if you jump off this boat, you're going to die. Now, it's interesting that the Apostle Paul told them that if we go out into this ocean the first time, he said, verse 10, not only of the cargo and of the ship, but also of our lives. You're endangering our lives. The very idea that there will be great loss and damage of our lives. Implicit in that is Paul's threat. Lives are going to be lost, but lives are not lost. Lives are not lost. Because God is providentially, sovereignly making sure that his servant is going to make it to Rome. And the benefit of that is the people with which the Apostle Paul is traveling. That is the promise that the angel gives Paul. God will make sure that everyone who is with you will make it. So here's the lesson that we get from Julius. Is that sometimes someone's going to come into your life where God has put you. And you have to be their Paul. where you have to be the Paul in the life that they are experiencing, and they're going to not trust you, they're not going to believe you, and they're going to perhaps even humiliate you. They may show kindness to you from time to time, but you must be persistent in what you know God has said to you. And Paul's courage to maintain his confidence in what God was going to accomplish was able to at least bring Julius and the other soldiers to understand. Of course, the other soldiers, the reason they stopped is their commander, the centurion, told them to stop. You're not going to get off this boat. Because Saul of Tarsus told us. But Acts 27 is not about him. It's not about justice. It's not about Julius. It's about Paul. And so we come to the speech where he says, beginning in verse 21, "Men, you should have listened to me." And then he says in verse 22, "I urge you to keep up your courage. There will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night, God's angel, to whom I belong, whom I serve, stood before me and said, 'Don't be afraid.'" So we find the evidence of a faith in a man who has sat in prison for 2+ years, awaiting to go to Rome, where he has wanted as an apostle to take the gospel, presumably for several decades. And every time he has wanted to go to Rome, every time those efforts, when he was a free man, were thwarted by God, providentially. That every time he wanted to go to Rome, every time he wanted to reach his aspirations and his dreams to bring the gospel to the city of Rome, God stood in the way. And the Macedonian call came to him, and he went to wherever God wanted him to go. And so Saul of Tarsus, who becomes Paul the Apostle to the Gentile, can only go to Rome the way God wants him to go, as a prisoner. That sometimes the dreams that we think that God has for us are not necessarily the dreams he really has. That this Paul, who had the ability to speak in such a way that people would listen, he kept those people in Athens so mesmerized by the things that he said of truth that they wanted him to come back the following week. He was not the kind of person who was able to seal the deal and make everyone listen, but he also was not the man who made everyone angry the first time he spoke, unless he wanted to. Remember, he did that once. He saw the Pharisees acting the way he did, and he says, "I'm on trial for the resurrection of the dead," and it sent the entire group of men into a frenzy, leading him to be imprisoned, leading him to be sent to Rome. But Paul's trip to Rome, God made happen in his time and in his way. How many times do we get frustrated with God because our trip to Rome doesn't happen in our life the way it should have? I should have been a husband. I should have been a wife. I should have been a parent. I should have been the owner of my own business. I should have been a deacon. I should have been an elder. I should have been a preacher. I should have been this. I should have been that. Why, God, have you not allowed us to experience our dreams come true? Because sometimes our dreams are not the kind of dreams that we need to realize. And in this case, in the book of Acts, as the unfolding of the final narrative from Luke shows us, is that God brings Paul to Rome, but as a bondservant. And then one last application, and then we'll be done. The whole book of Acts shows the development of the gospel being spread. And we talk about the book of Acts being how the church grew. And we also look at the book of Acts, and some people will say that the book of Acts is about how the Spirit moved the church. I'm going to agree that both of those statements are true. But the more I study Scripture, the more I think that really what the purpose of all of these books is for you and I to pay attention to God. That while we can be empowered and excited about the way we witness Christians growing and model in their behavior and in their faith and their courage, the things that we know we need in ourselves, we can read from the book of Acts and understand those things. We can look from the book of Acts and see what it was that they taught people to be saved. But what we need to see in the book of Acts is that God was accomplishing his purpose. And the Apostle Paul was very content with the purpose God had for him. So when he says in verse 24, the angel told me, "Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you." Therefore he said to them, "Keep up your courage, men, for I believed God, that it will turn out exactly as I've been told." I believe God. I don't know of three more powerful words that a man of faith can say. And I am a man of faith. I'm a man who loves the Lord and preach the gospel. But even in my own life, I can look back and I can think how many times in my life I have said to people, I believe God. Particularly in an environment where I'm getting ready to tell them, okay, I told you we shouldn't have headed out, and here we are. Spending 3 months, quote, quote, lost at sea, not really lost at sea, but lost at sea. And all of the human temptations and the prideful things that the Apostle Paul could have engaged in all of that dialogue, but for him, everything that needed to be said had to be about how he knew God was accomplishing his purpose. I believe God. Because the book of Acts is about how the sovereignty of God, a word that we don't like to say, but how the sovereignty of God accomplished his purpose. He brought Paul to Rome. Because Paul as a leader, certainly. Luke as the witness who was there. And Julius, got it right that time, saw in the Apostle Paul what you and I want to see in us. But God was the one who needed to be believed. So tonight, let me make these last applications. The metaphor of the storm is a great sermon-esque thing we do here. We could go to the sermon-esque part when he lands on the island and the snake bites and then he shakes the asp off. And so you have to shake it off. It's a great little sermon title we use. So when the storms of life come and the snakes bite, who will you believe? I'm just so stunned by the Apostle Paul because of this last application. He was standing in the middle of a storm. A wrecked life among other prisoners, maybe rightly charged, but he knew he was falsely charged. And what he told those people was, I believe God. And notice he says that when he knows he's going to Rome the way God wants him to go. A lot of times we'll turn to Jesus' story in Luke chapter 8 when he calms the storm. That a lot of times in our lives, we want to say to ourselves that God is just going to calm the storm. He's going to calm the waters. And everything in your life, it's just going to be calm. But not every storm gets calmed. And for the Apostle Paul, this storm did not get calmed. The wreckage did not end. But what faith in God can do, it can calm the heart in the storm. And that's the lesson we need to come away from. Is that the reason the heart can be calmed in the storm, even when the storm rages, even when the snake bites, is because God is sovereign. And I believe God. And in our culture, when flags fly and marches play, and media reports of great scientific advancements that humans have created, we must be the people who, when we witness the storm that the world's evil has created in itself, we need to be the people who say, I believe God. That who will know that God is the one who is sovereign. That God is the one who decides what will be. We make all of our choices. There's nothing against free will in that statement. Any more than any of the statements described about Julius observing Paul. All of that was free will while God remained sovereign. And you and I need to say the same. I believe God. If you're subject to heaven's call, won't you stand and come as together we stand and sing? I will praise you with all of my